Having created a number of these fake quotes videos in which I identify some of the most common and egregious misquotations, misrepresentations of particular philosophers, because I do like to stay in my lane. I'm probably not going to do Albert Einstein or the Buddha or people like that. I thought that it might be good to look at Augustine of Hippo, who, by the way, has a pretty massive body of work. So it could be that some of these are found somewhere within some writing that nobody's looked at, but the odds of that are incredibly, incredibly low. I think that we can say with 99% certainty that all of the fake quotes that we're going to identify and discuss here are indeed fake quotes, especially those of which we can source to somebody else. So, you know how these go. We're going to have 10 fake quotes. I'll try to tell you where they came from as best as we can. I'm relying on other people out there doing a good bit of the legwork to help out with this. So here they are. Fake quote number 1 is kind of a cool sentiment. Hope has 2 beautiful daughters. Their names are Anger and Courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain the way they are. And this is not something that sounds like a passage from Augustine. Those sorts of parallels, the way things are, don't remain the way that they are. That sounds kind of alien to his point of view. Now, interestingly, there will be talk later on about daughters when it comes to emotions in later writers, but usually it's framed in different ways. Now, we do know where this comes from. It's something that's attributed to Augustine by an author, Robert McAfee Brown, who wrote in one work called Spirituality and Liberation, Overcoming the Great Fallacy, that this is what Augustine said. And then in another work called Speaking of Christianity, he calls it a, quote, reflective comment whose location in the Augustinian corpus I wish I could pinpoint, meaning that he can't actually tell you where in Augustine's works it comes from, which is probably because it's not actually there. When people do searches, they don't find that coming up. So, fake quote, cool sounding, but not by Augustine. Here's another great sounding one. The world is a great book, of which they that never stir from home read only a page, which jibes with a lot of things that people have said over the years. So this is attributed to Augustine already in the early 1800s in Select Proverbs of All Nations by this author, John Wade, and later on is going to show up in some of these quips and quotes books as people circulate it. It's not in Augustine's writings, and people have traced it back to a variant from something found in Fougeray de Montbron, 1753, La Cosmopolite, saying that the universe is a sort of book whose first page one is read when one is seen only one's own country. And it gets quoted by Lord Byron in his poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. So it's circulating around, and eventually somebody tags it as being Augustine's when it's actually not. Here's another interesting one. God is always trying to give good things to us, but our hands are too full to receive them. Is this something that would be incompatible with Augustine's notions of grace? No, it wouldn't be incompatible. It's just that he didn't actually say something along those lines, and there's some interesting connections. So in C.S. Lewis's collected letters, he attributes this to St. Augustine kind of in a way. He says, St. Augustine says God gives where he finds empty hands. And this might be paraphrasing Augustine's homilies on the Psalms, where he says that it is good for the rich man to acknowledge his poverty if he thinks himself full. This is mere puffing, not abundance. Let him recognize his hands are empty so that God can fill them, right? So that's kind of a similar idea, but where it actually shows up seems to be in Gerald May's 2007 book, Addiction and Grace, Love and Spirituality and the Healing of Addictions, where he says, St. Augustine once said that God is always trying to give good things to us, but our hands are too full to receive them. And then he frames this in terms of addictions being what fill our hands. So not entirely divergent from what Augustine himself says, but it's not an actual Augustine quote. The next one is definitely not an Augustine quote, and it would be a weird thing for him to say. So the truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. Let it loose and it will defend itself. So this actually is probably from Charles Spurgeon, who was a pretty famous 19th century Protestant preacher, read by a lot of people even today, if they're old school. And he says in a speech that he gave at a meeting of the British and Foreign Bible Society, there seems to me to have been twice as much done in some ages in defending the Bible as in expounding it. But if the whole of our strength shall henceforth go to the exposition and spreading of it, we may leave it pretty much to defend itself. I do not know whether you see that lion. It is very distinctively before my eyes. A number of people advanced to attack him, while a host of us would defend the grand old monarch, the British lion, with all of our strength. And so he says, open the door and let the lion out. He will take care of himself. And this appears to be the origin of this quote. Here's another one that we can be pretty sure is not by Augustine, not only because it's actually derived from another later text, but it's not something that Augustine would say because of the meaning of the terms that have changed over time. Charity is no substitute for justice withheld. So in ancient times, caritas didn't just have the range of meaning that has to do with like distributing alms or doing things above and beyond that justice doesn't require you to do. And Augustine wouldn't have been using charity in this way. He would most likely have talked about giving alms or works of mercy rather than charity. Now, it does get quoted in Sidney J. Harris's Majority of One, but it appears to be a spurious quote. So another fake one for you there. This one, do not despair, one thief was saved. Do not presume, one thief was damned. This one goes back a long, long ways. So this is also attributed to Augustine in a 16th century document, The Repentance of Robert Greene, Master of Arts, who calls it a golden sentence of Augustine, right? He says, to this doth that golden sentence of St. Augustine allude, which he speaketh of the thief hanging on the cross. There was, saith he, one thief saved and no more. Therefore presume not. There was one saved. Therefore despair not. So this sounds like a interesting attribution, but we don't find it in Augustine's works. So it appears to be Greene perhaps misremembering or giving some extra explanation and application to this idea. Here's another one that you find. It's kind of a favorite of trad people in the present who are often committed to making women second-class citizens, particularly within religious contexts. Women should not be enlightened or educated in any way. They should, in fact, be segregated, as they are the cause of hideous and involuntary erections in holy men. Now, this is something that would go against a lot of the things that Augustine actually says about sexuality. And it's interesting because it does get attributed to another book, Helen Ellerby's Dark Side of Christian History, and they say that she quotes Augustine, but apparently she doesn't actually not only get this from Augustine, but say that Augustine said this. And looking around on the internet, it does appear in a book, Quotations on Terrorism, giving no source at all, but it appears to have taken on a kind of life of its own. So the beginnings of this one are a little bit murky, we could say. Here's another one that is a fairly recent coinage. To fall in love with God is the greatest of all romances. To seek him the greatest adventure. To find him the greatest human achievement. So this is not by Augustine. This is by Father Raphael Simon, who gets credited by it. And there's something like it in his book, The Formation of the Priest. It is a very modern sounding thing. Romances, I mean, the word romance was not around in Augustine's time. I struggle to think of what would actually be translatable from the Latin of Augustine's time as romances. Falling in love with God, Augustine stresses that the love that we feel for God is not the same kind of romantic love that we might feel for a wife or for, as he had in life, a concubine, right? So this is clearly, it's a cool idea, but definitely not Augustine. This is another one that you see often attributed to Augustine as well as to some other people, and it comes in a number of different variations. I'm just going to give you one that I see quite a bit. In necessary things, unity in doubtful things, liberty in all things, charity. Sometimes it's necessary gets turned into essential, and the doubtful can sometimes be non-essential or non-necessary, but the idea is that there's unity, liberty, and charity. So this was first used in 1617 by an Archbishop, Marco Antonio de Dominis, and he was kind of a troublemaker, actually got heresy charges brought against him, was the sort of person who really couldn't get along with too many people. Then there was a German Lutheran theologian who, a little bit later, Peter Maeterlinck, who said in 1626, if we might keep in necessary things unity and unnecessary things freedom, and in both charity, our affairs would certainly be in the best condition. Why would it get attributed to Augustine? I think for the same reason that a lot of things get misattributed, because it sounds better to say that it comes from Augustine or somebody else with similar stature than that it came from a more recent person. And, the Protestants, the early Protestants, were very much into Augustine, so it kind of figures into that. And here is our 10th one. Rome has spoken, the case is closed. Often arranged just in the Latin that's being attributed to Augustine. Roma locuta est, causa finita est. So this actually is, let's say, taking something out of context and then repurposing it. Because who likes to use this? The trad types that are like, the Vatican should be the arbiter of everything. And sometimes taken as a argument for Augustine endorsing the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. So, in fact, in Sermon 131, Augustine is going to say, already 2 councils on this question have been sent to the Apostolic See, and replies have also come from there. The case is closed, would that the error might sometime be finished as well. So he's saying these 2 African councils have given reports on the Pelagian matter, and the Apostolic See is the Bishop of Rome in this case. So he is saying causa finita est, because the Bishop of Rome is not making the decision. He is confirming the decision that the African councils made in condemning it and saying, yeah, this is done. We already decided, the Bishop of Rome weighed in because this is part of his territory. So it's a finished case. It doesn't mean what people like to think that it means, namely that Rome gets to decide and that's it, and you'd better get in line. So it doesn't have that meaning that a lot of people are using it with, and using Augustine's authority to try to prop themselves up. Finally, we get a bonus that is, again, not completely un-Augustinian, but is diverging from it and is at least technically a fake quote. If you're suffering from a bad man's injustice, forgive him, lest there be two bad men. So Augustine does say in his commentary on Psalm number 30, people who are our enemies, whatever sort they may be, must not be held in hatred, lest when a bad person hates a bad person from whom they're suffering, there be two bad people. Notice that there's no mention of injustice there, just badness. And there's also, kind of a explanation there. It's a fuller quote. So Augustine didn't say if you're suffering from a bad man's injustice, forgive him. He's saying let's not hate, but he's not actually saying forgive in this quote. He does say there will be two bad men, but there's a different twist to it, we could say. So there you have them, some of the most common fake quotes attributed to Augustine. You always want to be careful, so I'm just going to give you some reminders here about fake quotations. If you see somebody attributing something to a philosopher and they're not actually saying what work it comes from, there's a good chance it's a fake quote. There's so many of them floating around out there, so you should exercise some healthy suspicion and ask for people to tell you where they got something from. If it's a fake quote, usually they can't tell you where they got it from. They just took it from some quote site or from Goodreads or somebody else circulating it around. If you know that something is fake, then don't repost it, even if it sounds cool, because you're just adding to the slop that's out there. I would like to give a shout out to two places in particular when it comes to this. Folkstations, which is a great site for looking at some of these Augustine things, and then Quote Investigator is also quite helpful as well. So there you have it. We'll do more of these in the future, but this concludes our little examination of how people get Augustine wrong.